There are forces in human behavior that no one sees, yet everyone feels. You walk into a room and before a single word is spoken, something already happens. A decision is made. A silent evaluation begins. A subtle shift in attention takes place that determines who gets noticed and who disappears into the background. Most people think attraction begins with appearance, but that is only what is visible. What truly happens is far older, deeper, and more precise than physical beauty. It is psychological architecture. It is emotional mathematics, and it operates in silence. There is a moment measured in milliseconds where the human brain scans another human being and answers a question without permission. Is this person safe, valuable, and emotionally significant to me? That single unconscious judgment shapes everything that follows. Confidence, interest, desire, distance, engagement, even silence, and yet almost no one is aware they are broadcasting signals every second of their existence, because attraction is not something you chase. It is something you emit, and what you emit is controlled by forces you never consciously learn to regulate. This is where psychology becomes dangerous knowledge, because once you understand how attraction actually works, you stop seeing relationships as chance encounters and start seeing them as systems of perception, projection, and emotional calibration. There is a reason some people enter a space and become the center of gravity without effort, and there is a reason others try everything: appearance, humor, status signals, and still remain unnoticed. It is not luck. It is not fate. It is not even confidence in the way most people define it. It is alignment between internal state and external signal. When a human being is internally unstable, seeking validation, approval, or confirmation, they leak inconsistency, and the human brain is engineered to reject inconsistency at a primal level, because inconsistency signals uncertainty, and uncertainty, in evolutionary terms, signals risk. But when a person is internally stable, when they are not seeking permission to exist, not negotiating their worth in real time, they create something different. Predictability without boredom, presence without pressure, calm authority without aggression, and the mind responds to that with attention. Not because it is forced, but because it is drawn. This is the first secret of attraction. People are not attracted to what you show them, they are attracted to what they feel around you, and feelings do not require language, they require only perception. That is why attraction often feels instant. Not because something magical happened, but because the brain completed a pattern recognition loops faster than consciousness could interfere. In that loop, the mind scans for three things. Status: is this person grounded or unstable? Intent: is this person safe or unpredictable? Emotional resonance: do I feel expanded or contracted in their presence? If the answers align in the right way, attraction begins before awareness catches up, and this is where most people misunderstand everything. They try to perform attraction instead of becoming attractive. They learn scripts instead of states, techniques instead of internal regulation, signals instead of presence. But psychology do not respond to performance. It responds to coherence, and coherence cannot be faked for long, because the unconscious always detects the gap between what a person projects and what they actually are. This is why attraction collapses when someone becomes too eager, why it fades when validation is sought to openly, why silence can sometimes increase interest more than words ever could, because silence removes distortion, and in absence of distortion, the brain begins to fill in meaning. This is not romantic fantasy. It is neural processing. The human mind is not designed to receive full answers immediately. It is designed to interpret gaps, and in those gaps, imagination becomes powerful, sometimes more powerful than reality itself, which leads to another hidden truth. Attraction is not about clarity. It is about controlled ambiguity. Too much clarity kills curiosity. Too much availability kills tension. Too much explanation kills mystery, and without mystery, emotional projection collapses. When projection collapses, attraction weakens. But when ambiguity is stable, not chaotic, not manipulative, but calm and grounded, the mind begins to engage in deeper interpretation, and interpretation is where emotional attachment begins. This is why psychology behind attraction is not about doing more. It is about removing internal noise, because internal noise becomes external signal distortion, and distortion interrupts perception, and perception is where attraction lies. Not in words, not in gestures, not in appearance, but in how the nervous system reads another nervous system, and that reading happens faster than thought, faster than logic, faster than control, which is why most people cannot think their way into being attractive. They can only align themselves into it, and alignment is not a strategy. It is a state where nothing inside is begging to be approved, a state where presence is enough, a state where attention is given freely but not desperately, a state where silence is not discomfort but stability, and in that state, something subtle happens. Other people begin to adjust themselves around you without realizing it. They lean in slightly, they listen longer, they stay engaged without knowing why, because the nervous system is responding to equilibrium, and equilibrium is rare. In a world of constant performance, constant comparison, and constant psychological noise, stillness becomes magnetic. Not because it is loud, but because it is rare, and rarity is one of the oldest currencies of attraction in human psychology. But this is only the beginning, because once you understand how perception is formed, you begin to understand how it can be influenced, not controlled, not manipulated, but shaped through internal mastery, and that is where the deeper psychology begins. Attraction does not grow in certainty. It weakens there. What strengthens it is something far less comfortable for the human mind: controlled uncertainty. Not chaos, not confusion, but just enough unpredictability to activate attention. The brain is not a passive observer of reality. It is a prediction machine. Every second, it is trying to guess what will happen next and adjusting chemical output based on whether those predictions are confirmed or broken, and when prediction is broken in a safe way, something powerful is released. Dopamine, not the chemical of pleasure, but the chemical of anticipation. This distinction is where most misunderstand attraction entirely. People think attraction is about feeling good, but biologically, attraction is about looking forward. A person who is fully predictable becomes mentally mapped. Once mapped, the brain reduces energy allocation. Attention fades. Interest flattens. Not because something is wrong, but because nothing is unresolved. The mind does not bond with completion. It bonds with progression. This is why early attraction often feels intense, even overwhelming, because nothing is fully known yet, and the unknown forces the brain into active modeling. Every gesture becomes data. Every pause becomes meaning. Every absence becomes interpretation, and interpretation is where emotional investment begins, but there is a critical threshold. If uncertainty becomes too high, the nervous system shifts from curiosity into threat detection. Anxiety replaces attraction. Confusion replaces interest. Withdrawal replaces engagement. So the system requires balance, a narrow band between predictability and mystery. Too predictable boredom. Too unpredictable discomfort, just balanced desire. This is the architecture behind emotional tension. Tension is not conflict. Tension is incomplete resolution, a sentence not finished, a look that lingers slightly longer than expected, a response that arrives after a pause that feels intentional but not forced. These microgaps activate internal simulation, and internal simulation is where attraction deepens without external escalation, because the mind begins to participate in the experience rather than observe it, and participation is what creates attachment, but there is a deeper layer beneath this. Dopamine is not only triggered by uncertainty, it is also shaped by contrast. The human brain does not evaluate experiences in isolation. It evaluates them relative to what came before. A calm moment feels calmer after intensity. A pause feels heavier after engagement. A smile feels more significant after distance. This is why emotional rhythm matters more than emotional intensity. Most people attempt to create attraction through constant high energy, constant availability, and constant expression, but without contrast, nothing registers. The brain stops distinguishing signals, and when signals stop standing out, emotional encoding weakens. Attraction requires differentiation. It requires shifts, expansion and contraction, proximity and space, engagement and silence, not as manipulation but as natural emotional cadence. Like music, without rhythm, sound becomes noise. With rhythm, sound becomes meaning, and attraction is emotional music played between two nervous systems. There is also a subtle psychological mechanism at work: effort attribution. When something is easily available, the brain assigns it lower value, not because it lacks worth, but because no energy was required to obtain it. Value increases when effort is required to maintain attention. Not artificial effort, but genuine psychological engagement. When attention must be earned repeatedly through presence, depth, or emotional stimulation, the brain encodes higher significance. This is why overexposure kills desire and underexposure creates curiosity. But again, Balance is everything because absence without connection becomes detachment and presence without space becomes suffocation. The mind seeks a dynamic equilibrium between the two. Another hidden trigger is emotional ambiguity. When someone cannot be easily categorized, the brain stays active. Is this person safe? Are they interested? Are they emotionally available? Are they distant? This ambiguity forces continued evaluation, and continued evaluation maintains attention, but the danger here is intentional confusion. That is not what creates attraction. What creates attraction is stable depth with layered complexity, a person who feels consistent in core presence but not fully predictable in expression. This creates a psychological loop. The mind trusts the foundation but stays engaged with the details, and engagement is the fuel of emotional development. There is also a biological reason why emotional tension feels addictive. The nervous system does not distinguish clearly between emotional intensity and physical arousal pathways. Both activate similar internal systems of alertness and focus. This is why emotional uncertainty can feel physically noticeable: a tightening in the chest, increased attention, heightened awareness of the other person. These are not poetic interpretations, they are physiological responses to unresolved social prediction. Attraction, in this sense, is not a feeling. It is a state of sustained neural activation, but sustained activation requires regulation. If it remains too high for too long, the system burns out. So the brain cycles interest. Engagement rises, then stabilizes, then resets, then rises again. This cycle is what creates long-term attraction dynamics. Not constant intensity, but oscillation, and within oscillation, something subtle develops. Attachment without control. Interest without certainty. Connection without full understanding, and this is where attraction becomes deeper than surface interaction, because now it is no longer about what is visible. It is about what is being internally constructed, and once the mind begins constructing meaning around a person, that person is no longer just observed. They are psychologically integrated, not fully, not permanently, but enough to create emotional weight, and emotional weight is what people call chemistry, but chemistry is not random. It is structured, and it follows rules that most people never consciously learn. Yet they feel them every time they meet someone who changes their internal state without explanation, because attraction is not spoken. It is processed, silently, instantly, and deeply beneath awareness, and once you see that mechanism clearly, you begin to understand why some connections feel inevitable. Not because they are destined, but because they are neurologically reinforced through rhythm, uncertainty, and emotional tension, and this is only one layer of the system. Attraction is rarely about the other person, not in the way people assume. What is actually happening is more internal, more hidden, and far more psychologically precise. People do not fall for who someone is, they fall for what someone activates inside them. This is where projection begins. The human mind does not experience others directly. It experiences interpretations of others, and those interpretations are built from memory, emotion, and identity. Every encounter becomes a mirror, not a physical mirror, but a psychological one. When a person meets someone new, the brain instantly begins scanning. What does this remind me of? What version of myself do I feel around this person? What emotional state is being activated in me right now? And based on those answers, attraction either forms or collapses, because attraction is not only about the other individual. It is about the self that emerges in their presence. There is a subtle but powerful truth here. People are drawn to those who make them feel like a specific version of themselves. Not necessarily the real self, but a desired self, a forgotten self, or sometimes a hidden self they rarely access. This is why two people can meet under the same conditions and experience completely different levels of attraction. One person may feel invisible, another may feel intensely seen. The difference is not external. It is internal resonance, and resonance is a form of identity reflection. The brain constantly compares present emotional experience with stored identity templates. If a person activates a higher value identity state, confidence, openness, emotional expansion, calmness, the mind begins associating that state with them, and association creates attachment. Not instantly, but progressively, because the brain prefers coherence. It tries to connect emotional experiences into stable narratives, and narratives require a source. That source becomes the person who triggered the state. This is why attraction often begins after interaction, not during it, because the mind continues processing the emotional residue long after the moment has ended. But projection does something even more complex. It fills gaps. When information is missing, the mind does not remain empty. It constructs meaning, and that construction is influenced by personal history. A person who has experienced abandonment may interpret distance as disinterest. A person who has experienced inconsistency may interpret unpredictability as excitement. A person who has experienced emotional neglect may interpret minimal attention as profound significance. So what appears as chemistry is often a combination of present interaction and past emotional coding. This is why attraction can feel irrational, because it is not built only in the present. It is layered on top of past emotional architecture. There is also a deeper mechanism at work: identity reinforcement. People are drawn to what confirms who they believe they are or who they want to become. If someone sees themselves as independent, they are drawn to people who reinforce that independence. If someone sees themselves as emotionally open, they are drawn to people who reflect that openness. If someone sees themselves as unseen, they may even be drawn to people who make them feel slightly unseen, because it validates their internal story. This is not conscious, it is structural. Identity seeks confirmation even when confirmation is uncomfortable, and attraction often begins at the point of confirmation, but there is another layer that creates confusion. People are also attracted to disruption of identity. When someone introduces a state the brain is not used to, it creates recalibration. A calm person entering chaos can feel grounding. A chaotic person encountering calm can feel magnetic, because the nervous system is always trying to optimize equilibrium. So attraction can arise both from familiarity and contrast. Familiarity creates comfort. Contrast creates interest, and the balance between them determines emotional pull. This is why some connections feel strangely familiar and others feel unexpectedly intense. Both are identity responses, but projection can also distort perception. When someone becomes emotionally significant, the brain begins to complete their image. It fills missing traits with assumptions. It exaggerates desirable traits. It minimizes contradictions. This is not deception. It is cognitive efficiency. The brain prefers a complete story over incomplete data. So it constructs one, and that constructed version often becomes more emotionally influential than reality itself. This is why attraction can feel stronger than logic, because it is not based on what is fully known. It is based on what is being imagined, and imagination is emotionally potent. More potent than observation, because imagination is not limited by reality. It is guided by desire, but as more real data enters the system over time, the projection either stabilizes or collapses. If reality aligns with projection, attachment deepens. If reality contradicts projection too strongly, disillusionment occurs and attraction dissolves. There is also a subtle mechanism called self-extension. When someone feels attraction, they begin integrating the other person into their self-concept. They imagine shared experiences, shared emotional states, shared identity possibilities. The other person becomes part of an expanded version of self, and anything that becomes part of the self carries emotional weight. This is why loss feels so intense even when the relationship was brief, because the brain is not only losing a person, it is losing a projected extension of identity. Attraction, in this sense, is not just interpersonal. It is intrapersonal restructuring. Two identity systems interacting and reshaping each other through perception, and when this interaction becomes strong enough, the boundary between self and other begins to blur. Not completely, but enough to create emotional dependency, longing, or deep attachment, and this is where the psychology becomes irreversible in experience. Once a person becomes part of your internal narrative system, they are no longer just someone you met, they are someone your mind continues to simulate. Even in their absence, even in silence, even in uncertainty, because the mind does not easily delete emotionally significant models, keeps running them, refining them, replaying them, trying to resolve incomplete emotional equations, and attraction often lives in those unresolved equations. Not in resolution, but in continuation, and this is why some people remain mentally present long after physical interaction ends. Not because of reality, but because of internal construction, and once construction begins, it does not easily stop. There is a level of attraction that has nothing to do with words, appearance, or behavior. It is not performed, it is not learned, it is felt, and it emerges from something most people overlook entirely: the regulation of internal state. Because before attraction becomes psychological, it is physiological. The nervous system speaks first. Everything else follows. When a person enters a room, they do not just carry a body, they carry a state. That state includes tension levels, breathing rhythm, attention focus, emotional stability, and unconscious signals of safety or threat in other people. Without realizing it, read that state instantly. Not through logic. Through perception, the human brain is constantly scanning for cues of stability because stability signals safety, and safety is the foundation upon which all social engagement is built. This is where presence becomes the decisive factor. Presence is not loudness. It is not charisma in the conventional sense. It is not performance. Presence is non-fragmented attention. It is the absence of internal resistance while interacting externally. When a person is internally scattered thinking about how they are being perceived, what to say next, whether they are being accepted, their attention is divided, and divided attention produces unstable signals. The body communicates hesitation even if the words do not. Micro-expressions tighten. Speech rhythm fluctuates. Eye contact becomes conditional, and the nervous system of the other person picks up this instability long before conscious awareness does. But when a person is internally regulated, centered, steady, not chasing approval, the signal changes completely. There is no urgency in their presence. No hidden negotiation. No subtle dependency on reaction, and the absence of internal urgency creates external clarity. This clarity is experienced by others as calm authority. Not dominance, not superiority, but ground, and grounded is rare enough to be noticeable. The mind is not attracted to chaos it cannot interpret. It is attracted to patterns it can trust. This is why calm individuals often appear more magnetic. Without doing more, they are not adding signals, they are removing distortion, and when distortion decreases, perception sharpens. But there is a deeper layer here. Calmness is not just absence of emotion. It is regulated emotion, a controlled internal system where emotional energy exists but does not spill uncontrollably into behavior. This distinction is critical because suppressed emotion creates tension and uncontrolled emotion creates instability, but regulated emotion creates coherence, and coherence is what the brain interprets as emotional safety. Emotional safety is one of the strongest unconscious drivers of attraction because without safety, the nervous system cannot relax, and without relaxation, connection cannot deepen. Even if interest exists, it remains shallow. But when safety is present, something shifts internally. The brain reduces defensive scanning. Attention becomes more open, curiosity increases, and emotional bandwidth expands. This is where attraction begins to deepen without conscious effort. Another subtle mechanism is energy consistency. Most people fluctuate heavily in emotional output depending on context, validation, or internal mood swings. One moment expressive, the next withdrawn. One moment engaged, the next distant. This inconsistency forces the other person's brain into continuous recalibration, and recalibration consumes cognitive energy. Over time, the brain reduces investment simply to conserve resources, but a person with stable internal regulation produces predictable emotional rhythm. Not predictable in content, but predictable in tone, and tone stability creates ease. Ease creates comfort. Comfort creates trust, and trust is the foundation of sustained attraction. There is also a psychological paradox at work. People often believe intensity creates attraction, but in reality, intensity without stability creates exhaustion, and exhaustion reduces desire. Whereas calm intensity, controlled energy, deliberate presence, grounded expression creates depth because depth requires space, and space cannot exist in emotional noise. This is why silence, when carried by a regulated presence, can feel more powerful than speech. Silence is not absence. It is uninterrupted perception. In silence, the mind of the other person becomes active. It begins to interpret, imagine, and construct meaning, and in that construction, emotional significance grows, but only if the silence is stable. If silence is anxious, it feels like rejection. If silence is grounded, it feels like depth. The difference is internal state, not external action. Presence also alters perception of time. When someone is fully present, interactions feel slower, more expanded, more meaningful. When someone is distracted, interactions feel rushed and incomplete. Time distortion is not metaphorical here. It is cognitive processing speed variation. The brain allocates attention differently based on perceived significance, and significance is heavily influenced by presence. This is why some interactions feel memorable even if they are brief, and others feel forgettable even if they are long. Memory encoding is not proportional to duration. It is proportional to emotional and intentional intensity, but intensity alone is not enough. It must be organized, structured, regulated. Another important mechanism is non non-reactivity. Most people respond immediately to emotional stimuli: approval, rejection, curiosity, discomfort. This creates reactive presence, and reactive presence signals dependency on external input, but non-reactive presence signals internal stability. It communicates that the person is not controlled by immediate validation cycles, and this creates psychological space for attraction to grow. Because the other person does not feel pressured to manage your emotional state, they are free to experience you, and freedom increases engagement. Restriction decreases it. This is one of the most overlooked aspects of attraction. People do not want to feel responsible for stabilizing another person's emotional world. They are drawn to those who are already stable within themselves, because stability reduces unconscious burden, and reduced burden increases willingness to engage. At a deeper level, presence also affects perceived identity strength. When someone is grounded, they appear internally defined, not rigid but coherent, and coherence creates trust in perception. The brain prefers interacting with systems it can predict at a basic level, not because it wants control, but because it reduces cognitive load. So presence is not just a social skill. It is a neurocognitive signal of reduced complexity in interaction, and reduced complexity feels safe, but safety alone does not create attraction. Safety creates access. Once access is granted, other mechanisms, curiosity, projection, emotional tension, can operate freely. This is why presence is foundational. It opens the psychological door. Without it, nothing deeper can enter, and this is where most people misunderstand attraction. They focus on what to add, when in reality, attraction often increases when unnecessary internal noise is removed, because what remains after noise is presence, and presence is the quiet force that makes everything else meaningful. Not through effort, but through clarity, and clarity, when experienced by another human nervous system, feels like gravity. Subtle, invisible, but difficult to ignore, and once that gravity is felt, the interaction is no longer neutral. It has already begun to move inward. The human brain does not measure value objectively. It estimates it, and estimation is heavily influenced by one principle that runs deeper than preference: culture or personality. Scarcity. Not only physical scarcity, but psychological availability. The mind assigns value based on how difficult something is to access, understand, or retain. This is not a modern behavior. It is a survival mechanism. In environments where resources were limited, rarity signaled importance. If something was hard to obtain, it was likely worth more effort. That same system still operates today, but it no longer evaluates food or shelter. It evaluates people, tension, emotional availability, and perceived access. When a person feels easily obtainable emotionally, mentally, or socially, the brain reduces investment. Not because the person lacks worth, but because the signal of effort is missing. Effort, in psychological terms, is not only physical action. It is attention cost. How much focus is required to reach, maintain, or interpret someone. Low effort equals low activation. High effort equals increased cognitive engagement, but here lies a critical distinction. Scarcity is not absence. Scarcity is controlled availability. When something is completely absent, the brain eventually stops tracking it. When something is too present, the brain stops valuing it, but when something appears intermittently consistent enough to remain relevant, but not constant enough to become predictable, it creates heightened valuation. This is where scarcity becomes psychological tension, and tension becomes emotional investment. The mind begins to assign significance to what is not fully accessible, because incomplete access forces imagination to fill the gap, and imagination inflates value. Not artificially, but structurally, because the brain assumes, if I cannot fully map this, it must contain depth I have not yet understood. This is why ambiguity combined with stability creates strong attraction patterns. Not confusion, but layered accessibility. Enough presence to feel real. Enough distance to feel incomplete. This balance activates a continuous evaluation loop, and evaluation loops maintain attention longer than certainty ever can. There is also a phenomenon known as perceived selectivity. People are more drawn to those they believe have selective attention. Not because rejection is attractive, but because selectivity implies value filtering. If someone does not give attention to everyone equally, their attention becomes more meaningful when received. This is not manipulation. It is cognitive weighting. The brain assigns importance based on distribution patterns. Uniform attention, low value signal; selective attention, high value signal, but selectivity must be authentic. Forced selectivity is easily detected and creates distrust. Genuine selectivity arises naturally from internal priorities, emotional boundaries, and stable identity, and that authenticity is what makes it powerful. Another key mechanism is availability lag. When responses, attention, or emotional engagement are not instantaneous, the brain begins to interpret delay, not necessarily negatively but meaningfully. Delay creates internal simulation. Why was there a pause? What is happening in that space? Am I being considered? This internal questioning activates cognitive engagement, and cognitive engagement strengthens emotional encoding. However, if delay becomes inconsistent or erratic, it shifts from curiosity into anxiety, which leads to withdrawal. So again, balance is essential. Scarcity operates most effectively when it is predictable unpredictability, a stable rhythm of engagement and distance, not randomness but controlled variation. This is why emotional pacing is more powerful than emotional intensity. Intensity overwhelms. Pacing structures experience, and structured experience is what the brain remembers. There is also a deeper psychological layer: value transfer through attention. Whatever receives focused attention from a stable individual is perceived as more valuable by others because attention itself is interpreted as a cost-bearing resource. If someone who appears grounded, self-contained, and non-needy chooses to invest attention, that attention gains significance. Not because of effortful display, but because of perceived internal standard the brain interprets. If this person is selective with attention, then receiving it must mean something, and meaning creates attachment potential, but scarcity becomes distorted when it turns into avoidance or emotional withdrawal. True scarcity is not emotional unavailability. It is intentional allocation, presence given without desperation, distance maintained without disappearance, engagement offered without dependency. This balance produces what can be called emotional rarity. Not rarity of interaction, but rarity of internal state consistency in others, because most people fluctuate based on external validation. A person who does not fluctuate in that way becomes neurologically distinct, and distinction is what the brain tracks as important. There is also a paradox in scarcity. The more someone tries to simulate it artificially, the faster it collapses because the nervous system detects intention behind behavior. If scarcity is used as a tactic, it carries tension, and tension without grounding feels manipulative, but when scarcity emerges from genuine self-containment, it feels natural, and natural scarcity is what creates attraction that does not require effort to maintain. Another subtle mechanism is memory reinforcement through absence. When someone is not constantly present, the mind continues processing their image in isolation. This independent processing strengthens internal representation, and stronger representation equals stronger emotional imprint. This is why brief but meaningful interactions can have long-lasting impact, because the brain continues working on them without interruption. Constant exposure, in contrast, prevents consolidation because nothing is left to complete internally. Completion requires space, and space requires absence, but absence must be balanced with relational anchor points. Otherwise, memory decays instead of deepening. So attraction is not built on presence alone, nor absence alone. It is built on rhythm between the two, a controlled oscillation that allows the brain to both experience and process, and in that oscillation, value perception increases not because anything changes externally, but because internal construction intensifies. The person becomes more significant not by doing more, but by occupying more mental space over time, and mental space is not given. It is earned through psychological engagement loops. Once those loops form, they continue running even in silence, and that is where scarcity becomes powerful. Not in the moment of interaction, but in the continuation of thought after interaction ends, because what lingers in thought becomes emotionally reinforced, and what is emotionally reinforced becomes desired. Not immediately, but inevitably shaped through perception over time, the human brain makes decisions about people faster than it can explain them. Not gradually, not carefully, but almost immediately.